Some promises aren't spoken, they're carried in silence. Harrison Ford hadn't worn his old flight jacket in over a decade. But on the 17th morning of October, he pulled it from the back of a closet and folded a flag he hadn't touched since 2007. No words, just memory, and the weight of a name carved into stone. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was a quiet Tuesday at the Air Force Memorial, the kind of afternoon where time moved slower than the wind. Flags lined the edges of the stone plaza, their fabric whispering against the breeze. Tourists moved in loose clusters, snapping photos, pointing at the sweeping arches above. No one noticed the man at first. He had been standing still for 37 minutes, not blocking traffic, not holding a sign, just there, alone. He wore a faded bomber jacket, frayed at the collar. An old aviation cap sat low over his brow, casting shadow over eyes that hadn't blinked in a while. His hands were clasped gently in front of him, holding something tightly folded, an American flag, worn soft by years of being held the same way. A radio crackled in someone's earpiece. Up on the North Terrace, Special Agent Ray Dorsey adjusted his stance, eyes narrowing at the static pouring through his calm. Possible obstruction, the voice said. Male. 60s or 70s, standing too close to the southeast clearance route. No movement, might be casing the site. Dorsey's jaw flexed. He scanned the perimeter, then spotted the man near the far end of the memorial wall, unmoving, facing a name carved into black granite, standing directly in front of a security access lane, one reserved for emergencies and diplomatic detail. Dorsey didn't wait. He moved with practiced precision, boots clicking sharp against stone. Hand grazing his sidearm. Sir, he barked as he approached. I need you to step away from the wall. No response. This is a restricted perimeter. I'm asking you one time, step back now. Still nothing. The man didn't even shift his weight. His feet were planted shoulder-width apart. His breath, if it existed, was invisible. Tourists began to turn. A mother hushed her son. Someone lowered their camera. Dorsey's voice cut again, louder this time. Final warning. His hand moved to his holster. Click. Silence spread fast, like someone had vacuumed the air out of the plaza. The only sound now was the faint flap of flags overhead and the slow exhale of a woman near the central fountain. Then someone's phone went up, zoomed in, focused. A breath caught in a throat. Wait, that's another phone. Then another, a ripple of realization. That's not just some old man, that's Harrison Ford. Dorsey didn't flinch, but the grip on his weapon hesitated. The name buzzed through the crowd like a secret too big to hold. Harrison Ford, standing still as a statue. Wearing a real pilot's jacket, not a costume, not for a role. The jacket was worn at the elbows. The flag pressed to his chest was creased, not folded for display but carried, and the face, lined, resolute, silent, was not one of a man seeking attention. It was the face of someone who'd been there, who'd lost someone there. Dorsey glanced back at his earpiece. Static. No one corrected him. No one warned him what he was walking into. All he saw was a civilian disobeying federal orders on federal ground. He took one more step forward. Harrison Ford didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes stayed fixed on the name before him. A single name etched deep in the stone, Daniel Foster, Captain USAF, Kia, Afghanistan, 2007. Behind Dorsey, a boy whispered, "Is he filming a movie?" The mother beside him shook her head, but her voice didn't come. She was staring too hard. The agent raised his voice again, though something in it had cracked. "Sir, I need to see your hands clearly. Step back immediately or I will take action." The man did nothing, didn't even react, because this wasn't a performance. This was a ritual. 17 years, same day, same hour, same name on the wall. The man in the bomber jacket never gave interviews, never spoke to the press, never posed for pictures. He just showed up, always alone, always holding the same flag, always standing where his friend used to laugh and fly and exist. And now, with a gun pointed at him, he stood exactly the same, still silent, unmoving, and the crowd realized it before the agent did. This wasn't a man playing a hero. This was a man who never stopped being one. The crowd hadn't moved, not really. Phones stayed frozen in the air, eyes locked on the man who hadn't flinched since the moment the gun was drawn. Harrison Ford stood like he belonged to the stone beneath him, like the years had carved him into the memorial itself. His right hand gripped the folded flag tighter now. Not in fear, not as a shield, but as if he were keeping it from falling apart. A man near the edge of the plaza shifted. He wore a maintenance jumpsuit, aviation patches stitched across the chest, and a name tag worn half pale by time. He wasn't filming, he wasn't speaking loud. He just leaned toward the woman beside him and said quietly, "He taught him to fly, you know. That name, Daniel Foster, that was his student, young pilot, sharp, Brave. Harrison trained him on emergency descent procedures back in '06. 2 weeks later, Danny was in Kandahar flying evac in a sandstorm. The woman blinked, and he followed Ford's protocol to the letter. Saved 4 men, never made it back. No one said anything after that. Ford still hadn't moved. The name on the wall didn't glow. It didn't have flowers, no wreath, no medal. Just 6 letters that meant everything to one man who refused to forget them. Daniel Foster, Captain, USAF. Kia, October 21, 2007. The flag in Ford's hands bore creases older than most of the tourists watching him. The fabric was faded, not from display but from being handled, folded, packed, held, carried. The white had yellowed at the corners. The red had dulled to brick. It looked less like a national symbol and more like a personal relic, something pulled from memory rather than a drawer. He didn't hold it at attention. He didn't pose with it. He simply cradled it gently as if it were the last thing he owed someone, because it was. The story had made headlines once. Barely. A young airman dies in a failed evac flight. Storm visibility less than 20 feet. Bird went down near Kunduz. But what they never reported, what no one knew except a handful of instructors and a command report buried in classified files, was that Danny had executed the landing exactly the way Harrison taught him. Flaps locked, skids low, burnout brake maneuver from a single-engine simulation. He got them on the ground, even as the rotors cracked, even as the mountain chewed metal. He'd survived the impact, and died minutes later shielding a medic. Ford never spoke about it, never claimed responsibility, never gave an interview, but a security camera caught him here 1 year later, standing in front of Daniel's name before sunrise. Same jacket, same boots, same folded flag, and then again the next year, and the next. He never came with press, never made a sound. He stood in silence from the minute the sun crested the Lincoln Memorial behind him, until the shadow of the central spire crossed the granite panel at dusk. He never brought flowers, never wore medals, just the jacket and the flag. The man in the maintenance suit exhaled slowly. "People think he comes to honor him," he said under his breath, "but I think he comes to stand in his place, like a shift he's still covering." Someone nearby swallowed hard. The weight in the air had changed. What started as awe was now something heavier, not just admiration, not just recognition, something that came from seeing grief that had shape, that had ritual, that didn't fade. A girl near the fountain lowered her phone. It wasn't just that Ford stood there every year. It was that he stood in the exact same spot. Same time, same date, same hour. He was never late, never early. It was the kind of precision only the military understood, and the kind of pain only survivors carried. No one needed to ask why he did it. The answer was already written in the silence between his breaths, because Daniel Foster never got to stand there again. So Harrison did. Not for photos, not for legacy, but because somewhere in a burning desert 7,000 miles away, a young man died flying the way his instructor taught him. And Harrison never let go of that. Not the memory, not the flag, not the promise. She couldn't have been more than 8. A red cotton dress, slightly wrinkled, fluttered around her knees as she stepped forward. In her hands, a crumpled bouquet, paper flowers, carefully twisted from crepe and construction scraps, the kind made with too much glue and too much heart. Her shoes tapped gently against the stone as she walked toward him, toward the man everyone else was afraid to get close to, toward Harrison Ford. Her mother noticed too late. One hand reached out, missed by inches. "Emma, wait," she whispered, but the girl had already passed the rope barrier, already crossed the invisible line between audience and memory. Agent Dorsey saw movement. He didn't see a child. Not at first. He saw a shape entering a restricted zone, a breach. His training fired before his judgment did. "Stop," he snapped, stepping forward fast. His hand shot out, not with violence but force. The open palm met her shoulder, not hard, not cruel, just enough to send her off balance. Her foot caught the edge of a stone slab, her knee buckled, and then she was falling. There was no scream, no dramatic crash, just the soft, heartbreaking sound of skin meeting granite and paper flowers scattering in all directions. Red and white petals tumbled across the walkway, fluttering like broken memories. Her hands scraped first, then her knees, then silence. The silence hit like a wave. A camera clicked, then another, then none. They weren't filming a ceremony anymore. They were witnessing a mistake. The mother gasped, frozen in place. A boy nearby muttered. He pushed her. "No," someone else whispered. He panicked. But intent didn't matter, because now there was a child on the ground, and a man with a gun in the frame. Emma didn't cry. She looked up, confused, cheeks flushed with embarrassment more than pain. Her palms were scraped raw, her knees were red and dusty. Her bouquet lay shattered around her, petals separated from stems, tape peeling from the edges, and through it all, Harrison Ford had not moved, not until that moment. He didn't step forward. He didn't speak. But his right hand, the one holding the flag, shifted. He gripped it tighter, not in anger, not in fear, in restraint, like he was holding something inside. Like if he didn't tighten his grip, he'd break the world in half. Dorsey's hand twitched. He stepped back half a pace, suddenly unsure whether he was still the one in control. His badge felt heavy now, not powerful, just visible, and the eyes around him were no longer confused. They were focused. Everywhere people began to move, not toward the child, but toward their phones, not to call for help, but to capture proof. The moment wasn't about rules anymore. It was about what it meant, about what it revealed. The man with the badge had lost control. The man who never moved had just changed everything. Harrison didn't bend down, didn't reach out, but his gaze, slow, deliberate, lowered to the girl, then to the flowers, then to the space where her innocence had met a perimeter line. And in that stillness, something shifted in the crowd. No words, no orders, just the understanding that the silence had been disturbed. The kind of silence that shouldn't be broken by a weapon. A young man near the edge of the plaza shook his head. "This was supposed to be a memorial," he said softly. "Now it's a standoff." A woman next to him added, "No, it's a reckoning." The girl sat up slowly. Her mother rushed in, kneeling beside her, checking elbows, brushing dirt from her face. No screaming, no chaos, just careful hands and a mother's eyes filled with disbelief. Dorsey opened his mouth, then closed it. What could he say? That he didn't mean to? That it was a mistake? Everyone already knew that. But it didn't matter, because the moment had already spoken louder than he could. He hadn't just pushed a child, he had pushed something sacred. And Harrison Ford, without moving an inch from where he stood, had just drawn a line no one else dared cross. The crowd didn't speak. They didn't move, not out of fear, but out of something heavier. Reverence maybe, shock definitely, and somewhere in the silence the sound began, soft, rhythmic, wheels against stone, a quiet creak, slow and steady, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. A man in a wheelchair was moving forward. He wore a faded olive-green flight jacket. The patches were sun-bleached, one sleeve stitched at the shoulder. His left pant leg pinned neatly up at the thigh. No flag, no camera, just breathe, controlled and short. Each push of the wheels brought him closer to the scene. No one stopped him, not the officers, not the crowd, not even Dorsey, whose grip on the weapon had begun to tremble. The man rolled forward until he reached the space between the agent and Harrison Ford. Then he stopped. He looked up once at Ford, no nod, no smile, just acknowledgement. Then he turned toward the agent, locked the wheels of the chair and began to climb out. He didn't ask for help, didn't wait. His hands gripped the armrests, arms shaking under the strain. His right leg braced against the stone, his left gone below the knee. It took 2 tries, but he did it, on one knee, back slightly hunched, breathing uneven, one hand gripping the edge of the chair for balance. The other extended, open palm, between the gun and the man who had never moved. "You don't get to do that," he said. His voice was low, gravel-thick, carried just enough to be heard. Dorsey blinked. "Sir, step aside." No, the word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The veteran's eyes were glassy, not with fear, not with pain, with memory. "He saved me," the man said. "Not in a movie, not on a screen. In Utah, winter of '99. I was pinned under a snow machine halfway down a ridge no one should have been riding. The rescue bird was grounded. Every pilot said no go, not him. He pointed, not at the badge, not at the gun, but at Harrison. He flew an old Bell 407 with a cracked windshield and a left skid that barely cleared brush. Said, "Hold on, I'll make it quick." And he did. The crowd didn't gasp. They breathed in together. A collective silence that pulled tighter with every word. He didn't ask who I voted for, didn't care what unit I served in, just pulled me off that ice like I was the only thing that mattered. He's the reason I'm still here. He looked back at Dorsey. "So no, you don't get to point that at him, not here, not anywhere." Dorsey's jaw clenched. The gun still hovered, unsure now whether it was threat or burden. The man's voice dropped lower. He never told anyone, never asked for credit. Just flew out. Disappeared before the local station could even catch his plate. I only found out years later who he was. He turned slightly, enough to face Harrison. "And you kept showing up. Every year, right on time, like it wasn't for us. Like it was for someone you lost. Someone who flew and didn't land." Harrison didn't reply. He didn't blink, but the way he gripped the flag again said more than words ever could. The veteran looked at the crowd now. He's not just a face on a screen. He's not here to be seen, he's here to keep watch. And then, just as slow as before, he lowered his head, not for a speech, not for applause, but because some men stand by standing still, and some kneel to protect the quiet they survived to remember. And in that moment, no one thought about Hollywood. No one thought about fame. They thought about what it meant to be remembered. what it meant to be the one who came back, and the one who never forgot. It started at the edges. No sirens, no shouted orders, just presence. 3 figures emerged from behind the east columns, not fast, not loud, just moving with the kind of stillness that didn't ask permission. Tactical boots, deep blue uniforms, no insignia, no name tags, no radios, just clean collars, pressed sleeves, and eyes that had seen things civilians weren't meant to. Then more, 2 from the reflecting pool path, 1 from the tree line. They didn't speak, they didn't gesture. They just stepped into formation instinctively, naturally, surrounding no one, protecting no one, but placing themselves in a quiet, intentional perimeter, not around the crowd, around the agent. Dorsey didn't notice them at first. His eyes were still locked on Ford, his gun still held high, his breathing shallow and uneven. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, but it no longer meant what it used to. And then she appeared. From behind the nearest column came a woman in a black uniform coat, collar sharp, posture sharper. She didn't run, she didn't raise her voice. She walked calmly into the plaza like she'd done it 100 times before, hands behind her back. No weapon drawn, no rank visible, but every operative in blue straightened as she passed. The crowd didn't part, she didn't ask them to. They stepped aside anyway. She stopped 10 feet from Dorsey. Her eyes didn't flinch, her voice didn't rise. "Agent Dorsey," she said, "lower your weapon." He didn't respond. "Ma'am," he stammered after a second, trying to reassert his posture. "I'm on federal detail." This man failed to comply with 3 lawful orders. He crossed a restricted perimeter and failed to identify. "You failed," she said, cutting through him like a scalpel. "You failed to recognize where you are and who you are speaking to." Dorsey blinked. "He's a civilian. He's not just a civilian." She took 1 step closer. "You're pointing a gun at the man who trained Tier 1 rescue units in 06, who taught vertical descent to National Guard pilots in winter terrain, who landed a Bell 407 in a storm no one else dared fly into, just to pull 2 lost children off a canyon ridge in Idaho." Murmurs moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. A young man near the back whispered, "He did that." A woman near the center nodded. "I remember, the news said it was a local pilot. They never said it was him." The officer's voice remained calm, but it filled the plaza. "He's not here by accident. He's not here for show. He's here because every year, without fail, he honors the name of a man who died flying what he taught." She let the silence return for a breath, then another. "You're pointing a weapon at a man whose presence at this memorial has been quietly sanctioned by the Department of Defense since 2008. A man who never asked for recognition, never asked for privilege. He just showed up, like this, every year." Dorsey's gun lowered slightly. The weight of the moment pressed harder now, not just the weight of failure. Weight of being the only one who didn't know, the only one who thought the silence was weakness. Behind the officer, one of the operatives leaned to another. "That's the guy," he whispered. "The one who taught emergency night evac in Utah, back in 09. The other nodded. "Built a fire with wet pine and a pocket knife. Didn't speak the whole weekend, just led." Ford didn't react. He didn't nod, didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the name that wasn't his. The name he had returned for, every year. The officer looked at the crowd now. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here to remind you all, sometimes the quietest man in the room carries the most weight." Then she looked back at Dorsey. "You are surrounded by federal and joint operational personnel. You are outnumbered, outranked, and out of time. This is not your perimeter anymore." The pause that followed wasn't just silence. It was judgment. 1,000 people watching. No applause, no outrage, just presence. Some stood taller. Others placed hands over their hearts, not in protest, not in defiance, but because they understood. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about recognition. And for the first time that day, America remembered. He didn't speak. Not when the agent stepped back. Not when the woman in the black coat gave a silent nod. Not when the plaza itself seemed to exhale for the first time in half an hour. Harrison Ford just looked at the wall. One name, one promise. Then slowly he moved, not toward the crowd, not away from the gun, just downward. He knelt, not with ceremony, not with drama. It was quiet, natural, like his body had known this movement for years. The sound of his knee touching stone was soft but final. His hands, steady despite the years etched into them, reached for the old leather duffel bag at his side. No one had noticed it before. It had been there the entire time, sitting against the base of the wall. A faded strap, scratches along the zipper, dust caked in the seams. He opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in a faded pilot's map and tied with a thin strip of canvas, was another flag, smaller, older. Its colors had long since lost their brightness. The white stripes carried a beige tint. The stars looked gray beneath the fading blue. The fabric was frayed, edges soft and threadbare. It wasn't folded like a display. It was folded like it had been carried, tucked, stored, protected. He cradled it for a moment, held it the way someone might hold the last letter they ever received, not looking at it, just knowing it. Then he leaned forward and placed the flag at the base of the wall directly beneath the name, Daniel Foster, Captain USAF, Kia, Afghanistan. No one moved, no one dared. It was an act that didn't need explaining, a ritual that didn't need narration. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt sacred, like something was being completed. Harrison stayed there for a beat. Just one. His fingers touched the flag a final time, and then he whispered. It wasn't for microphones, it wasn't for the crowd, but the little girl, the one with the paper flowers still clutched in her lap, heard it, just enough to understand. Today you get to stand watch again. I just kept the shift warm. He didn't cry, he didn't tremble. He just let the words fall like breath, and they landed on the stone like memory. Behind him, a breeze lifted the edges of jackets, tugged gently at flagpoles, but it didn't reach him. It stopped like even the wind knew better than to interrupt. People watched from every side. No one touched a phone. No one said a word. They just stood, witnessing something they couldn't name, a completion, a closing, not grief, something older than that, something earned. Because this wasn't the first time Harrison Ford had done this. But it was the last. 17 years, every year, same day, same hour, same stone. He had come alone, he had stood alone, and he had remembered alone. But this time he wasn't alone. This time the memory belonged to more than just him. He stood slowly, deliberate, measured, like the weight he carried had shifted, like something inside had finally been laid down, not forgotten, never that, but finished. He didn't pick up the flag he first arrived with. He left it there, beside the older one. Two promises folded together, side by side. One carried for 17 years, the other carried no more. The petals were still scattered across the stone, wrinkled, torn, some crushed beneath hurried feet. But the little girl didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, quiet now, the weight of the moment wrapped around her like a scarf. Her bouquet had lost its shape, the tape unraveling, the colors dulled. Still, she gathered the pieces with both hands, careful, precise. One by one, she picked up what remained of the flowers she had meant to offer earlier. Harrison Ford stood only feet away, tall, still, his arms at his sides, his shadow cast long against the wall. She didn't speak, she didn't look at him. She simply knelt, placed the reformed bouquet gently next to the two folded flags, and stepped back. The plaza watched, and then her mother came forward. She wasn't shaking, she wasn't yelling. She moved with the kind of strength that only comes from clarity, from knowing what's been broken and what still matters. She stopped in front of Dorsey, close enough for her voice to be heard, quiet enough to make everyone listen. You didn't shove a child, she said. You shoved the quiet. The words hung there. You shoved the one thing people come here to find, the thing we can't name but feel when we stand too close to names we'll never forget. Dorsey said nothing. His badge was still on his hip, his weapon holstered now, limp with shame. The mother looked at Harrison, then back to the agent. He didn't need to move, he didn't need to speak, because we already heard him. The moment you raised that gun, the moment you broke what this place protects, we didn't see power, we saw a man afraid of silence. A ripple moved through the crowd, not sound, not applause, a shift. They were no longer observers, they were witnesses. A man near the back raised his voice just enough. My father's a firefighter, years ago. He trained in emergency aerial extraction. Always said the guy teaching him was quiet, older, knew more than the manual. Taught them how to read wind by watching trees. My dad never told us his name, said he wasn't the kind of man who wanted that. The man paused. He saw the video yesterday, said that's him, that's the man who taught me how to land when the blades ice over. A woman near the center added, my brother was stationed in the mountains when a bird got shot down. They said the evac was flown by a civilian, said they never got his name, just that he had the calmest voice on the comms. Others didn't speak, they didn't need to. They stepped forward, not toward Harrison, not toward Dorsey, toward the flags, toward the name, Daniel Foster, Captain USAF, and they stood not side by side, but scattered evenly like markers, each one facing the wall. Some placed a hand over their chest, some lowered their heads, some knelt. There was no instruction, no speaker, no chant. Just the kind of silence that doesn't come from absence, but presence. And in that silence something shifted again, not in the air, not in the crowd, in the understanding. This wasn't a story about conflict anymore. It was about completion. A small boy near the front looked up at his grandfather, his voice no louder than a breath. Is he going to leave now? The old man smiled, slow and tired. No, son, he said. That's the whole reason he came. And the boy understood. The plaza didn't empty. It settled. People didn't leave. They stayed, not to watch, but to be there to hold space. For the man who had held it alone for 17 years, Harrison didn't look around, he didn't nod, he didn't acknowledge the shift, because it was never for that, it was never for them, it was always for the name that never got to come home, and for the promise to never forget. As the sun dipped lower, light stretched across the stone, warming the edge of the folded flags, and somewhere in that light, without sound, the memory of Daniel Foster stood tall again, not alone, not anymore. He had company now, not just from the man who kept watch, but from a country that finally remembered why. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.